Like, I remember when I was growing up, like, they were talking about streets of gold being in heaven. The New Jerusalem's coming to earth. Does that mean heaven's going to be on earth? I start considering all these metaphors or these symbols as being really just kind of like a form of mythology, so to speak. But it's really touching on things that are legitimate, like real physical things, but they're being embellished.
One of the issues that we have a tendency to do what's called reification. That is to say, we take things that are metaphysical or metaphoric even, and we solidify them in our thoughts, and we can't get out of this I guess way of thinking. The way I look at it is, you look at the heavens and the earth as being essentially that which is heavenly or upper level or the ultimate meaning behind the words or behind the sayings, and then you have the surface level, the earthly level. That the idea is that when you take things literally at and only at face value, then that blinds you to the higher level meaning or the heavenly meaning.
Hi, I'm Charlie Forbes, and welcome to Contemplating the Cosmos. In today's episode, my guest, Robert Ferrell, and I will be discussing some deep issues in Christianity. We will be discussing the many deep layers of interpretation and meaning, not only in the biblical scriptures, but the extra-biblical texts as well. So stay tuned as we go deep into these topics, as we continue contemplating the cosmos.
Thanks everybody for joining us. This is Charlie Forbes with Contemplating the Cosmos. I have a very special guest, Robert Ferrell, who's joining us today, and it is my great pleasure to speak with you and break down some of this deep philosophical, deep spiritual type stuff that we have in Christianity, but sometimes people don't touch with a 10-foot pole. So anyways, as far as Robert, he has the channel Apocraphile 1970, and I guess he has a lot of other resources you could probably visit too. I think he has a BitChute account too that I just noticed that he had. So maybe give a brief little introduction about yourself, Robert, and then we can kind of branch out from there.
Okay, well, again, my name is Robert. Basically, I grew up sort of as an atheist / agnostic. I was always sort of shied away from religion and stuff, and hence I didn't know that much about it. I had the usual, I guess, misconceptions about Christians being, I don't know, maybe not as scientifically minded, or as I had all those ideas and stuff, and I was a little bit rabid at the time, to be honest with you, and so I never believed in God, but there were certain things that sort of happened to me, like that were, I don't know, they were a little bit hard to explain by mere chance, just things that defied chance, like certain names kept appearing in my life, and, certain kinds of things that just seemed improbable started happening to me. And this was all at a time when I was affirming that there was no God and everything. And so... Is
that like synchronicities or something?
Yeah, synchronicities for the most part. I mean, I could go into particulars, but I mean, by and large, it was just... one thing after another, people with identical names would just things like that would happen to me that just seemed to defy random odds and stuff, and got me thinking that maybe my ideas about who's running the show here were maybe a little bit off. Maybe there's a little more something behind the scenes and stuff. Yep. And so when I converted, my conversion was also sort of very tough because I couldn't, if you will, bend the knee of my heart at the time. I was very sort of prideful, I guess, and I was at a place where somebody was interceding for me, and at the time when we were doing prayer and they were interceding on my behalf, and I just felt something change inside of myself. What I'm saying? I had like one of those genuine come to Jesus, sort of conversion type experiences, and I genuinely felt like a totally different person at that point.
Transformation.
And so, it was a real sort of spiritual battle within myself. And then, at that point I was sort of had a certain fervor, I guess, and so I said, this is the truth, and so I started reading the Bible, of course, and like I read it sort of methodically. I read it from beginning to end, Genesis all the way through Revelation, just like it's laid out, and I kept coming across these statements. I mean, among all the other things I was looking at, of course, I mean, I was reading it on, the same level as everybody else, but it sort of stuck in my mind that there was all these little off-ramps, I guess, to other books.
Yeah.
If you want to read about this, go read it in this book. And you want to read about that, go read it in that book. And by then I had been in college for a little while. And I was out of college at the time that I became a convert. And I remember one of my college roommates had a Bible. And one time I opened up his Bible, and I noticed that I had opened up to a book called the Maccabees or something. And, the few times I was ever dragged to church, usually by a relative or on special occasions as a kid or whatever, I would just sort of thumb through the Bible just because there was nothing else to do. The guy's up there talking, and I'm just sitting here with a hymnal and a Bible, and so I'm looking through it. I never remembered seeing the book of Maccabees in it. So I remember commenting about it at the time to him. I was like, I've never seen this book. I've never seen that book, right? And then he just flat out told me that he was Catholic, and that they just have different numbers of books in their Bible. And that was when I was still an atheist. And I remember sort of chuckling to myself at the time, like, you don't even agree on a basic canon, and you are out there on the streets, professing it. You know what I'm saying?
Believe it or not, me coming from the other side of the spectrum, being raised into the Protestant church, I actually said the same thing. Is like, why don't we agree from the Christian perspective as far as that goes?
So, but that question mark was already in my mind, sort of way in the background of my thinking when I became a convert, because at that point I was like, well, why does it keep telling me to go to this book and telling me to go to this book and another book? And, why was I continually finding this stuff? And then I would go research it, and half the time these books didn't even exist. So I was looking for Jasher, and I was looking for Edo, and this was way back before the internet, so stuff like this was really hard to come by, and it just seemed like there were very few resources, and what little information there was, all sort of had that scholarly bent. Yeah, this book exists, but it's bunk or something, basically words to that effect, and it was full of this scholarly biases, I guess. But
exactly.
What really got me was that, there was just sort of the cumulative effect of all that. But, of course, it always ends up with Jude. I remember going through Jude at the time and looking at, the verses 14 and 15. Those are like this is like classic example of something that you just have to stop and look at. It's just one of those things that makes you wonder.
That's the thing that kind of threw me over the edge too, was Jude, as far as researching this stuff.
Because when you look at the particular wording of it, I remember this sticking out in my mind, like, wait a minute. So I have come to believe in God, and I've come to believe in the inerrancy of his word. And this is something that everybody has in their Bible. Everybody agrees with this. The Catholics have Jude. Protestants have Jude. Everybody has Jude. And so when he says, for example, in Enoch, also the seventh from Adam, prophesied, and then it gives you the quote, you just look at the data, and this is what's interesting to me, because it doesn't matter whether you're Christian, atheist, Muslim, whatever walk of life you come from. Mm-hmm. If you look at it just as a literary feature that exists in a book, that literarily he cites the name of the source, Enoch also, he cites the antiquity, he says it's the seventh from Adam, right? Mm-hmm. He says that he prophesied, so he calls him a prophet, and then that quote matches the quote that's in this book.
Yeah.
Right? So in other words, you have the title of the book, and you have the contents of the book there, and then you have the fact that he says that it's ancient and prophetic. You know what I'm saying? And so in other words, whatever your belief system is, whether you're atheist or not, you can look at it from a literary basis and say this is in fact his belief. And and at first. Mm-hmm. At the time, I mean, before I came to that knowledge, though, of the book actually existing, I mean, I looked at the footnotes, and it directed me back to Genesis chapter 6. Now, I hadn't read that. That didn't sound familiar to me. that quote, right? And so I went back and I looked at it, and it wasn't there. And so I started looking at other Bibles, and I finally came across one that literally all it said was cited from the non-canonical Book of Enoch, is all it said. And then it sort of blew me for a loop, because
you said that the chapter 6 of Genesis referenced the Book of Enoch.
Well, it talked about the sons of God came down and they made daughter men. 6:1-4.
And Noah was the only one left perfect in his generation, or whatever.
Right. I mean, it referenced that, but the idea was that there was an actual book, and like I said, the footnotes that I was reading simply said cited from the non-canonical Book of Enoch, just like it was just sort of okay, and that's it. And there was no need to stop there and think about that for a minute, like why he would do that. And and the interesting thing was, I started looking for the Book of Enoch, and I couldn't find it in a Christian bookstore. I ended up having to order me one, just an old SPCK version of it, I think, from a secular bookstore. And I ordered it and I read it. And again, this was before the internet, so you really needed a hard copy if you wanted to read something. So I finally got it. And what really blew my mind was, right out of the gate, right before you even get to verse 9, where that quote is actually from, it says that it's not for his generation, but for a remote one, which is to come. Yeah. Concerning the elect, right?
Yes.
And so, in other words, he gives you another piece of information that explains why this book is not in the canon, because it's not for this generation. It's set aside exclusively for the time of the end.
So was that kind of an instruction for those in Ezra's time, as far as the initial canonization of I don't know, what would you call it? The Torah was there, and the Tanakh or whatever. But as far as the assembling of scriptures, do they actually set it apart from the scriptures because of that instruction, quote unquote?
You're asking if it's deliberate. I think it may have been to a certain extent. When you read the book of Ezra, fourth Ezra, second Ezra, is sometimes called, it talks about there being 24 books that were set aside for both the worthy and the unworthy, and that there were 70 books, which may be a symbolic number, by the way. 24 may just be symbolic of canon, and 70 may just be symbolic of those are the books for the the age or whatever, the seventh millennium or whatever. There's some symbolic aspect to it. There may not be an actual list of just 70 books from which to choose, because there were books that came afterwards, of course. But that being said, the idea was that the canon was for the worthy and the unworthy. It means a congregation of people who believe and who don't believe, or people who understand and people who don't understand, a mixed congregation. And that's essentially what you would have until the time that these books were meant to be revealed. You would have people believing the 24. Like the other place where the number 24 is mentioned is in the Gospel of Thomas, where they come up to Jesus and they say 24 prophets spoke in Israel, and all of them spoke in you, or of you. And Jesus says to them, but you have neglected the one who is before you, and has spoken only about the dead. And that's an interesting thing too, because the idea is that the ones who believe in just the 24, Jesus describes as the dead. And in Ezra, the people who just read the 24 books, he talks about that these are for the worthy and the unworthy. So again, these are negative connotations. You know what I'm saying? The idea is that every time you're actually confronted with this little tidbit of data about the 24, there's always this negative connotation attached to it. In other words, he's speaking of the dead, or he's speaking of the mixture of the worthy and the unworthy, rather than those which are set aside, which are exclusively for the worthy. And even in the Gospel of Thomas, he talks about that he, to the worthy, are the ones that he reveals his mystery. So he reveals his mystery to those who are worthy.
So real quick, I kind of want to address for those of whoever are listening that might be having a knee-jerk thought on some of these biblical or not, I'm not going to say biblical books, but the extra biblical, like such as the Book of Thomas. I mean, I had kind of a knee-jerk reaction when before I ever started looking into this stuff, that like the Book of Thomas was considered like a Gnostic text. And the reason I reached out to you is because you could say that I've been kind of going down the rabbit hole of trying to figure out the complexities of the faith and just the world that we live in general. And believe it or not, actually, the first channel I subscribed to was Apocraphile 1970. That was
Really?
probably 7 years ago, I would say.
Wow, that is a long time ago.
I know. I think it was that long ago because the first time I ever ran into your channel was from Book of Enoch.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, that was just something I wanted to. That was actually something when I first uploaded it. Was just again, that was just something I had lying around because way back in the day, like in the early '90s, when I first started kind of getting into this stuff, I went to the Walmart and I bought tapes and I just started reading out of these books that I had just on a tape and just to listen to. So I had all this stuff lying around like in 2005 or whatever. I had all these books recorded and even some videos that I had made with this primitive, VHS camera that I had set up in my house, just basically to see how I came across on the other end, to see if, my ideas made sense just listening to them, you know what I'm saying? So I had that stuff lying around from like about 1999 or 2000, like the one you may be wrong about the Apocrypha or Good Things Come in Threes. That's from like 2000. So that goes way back. That's like 20 years ago. That's like 20 years ago. And the funny thing about it is that literally nothing has really changed other than to become clearer and more refined in all that time. So it's that to me is just it's incredible that what I'm saying, it all just sort of happened kind of at once. It was weird, these ideas started coming to me, and it just was amazing to just keep finding them and finding them and finding them,
Yeah, before I ever stumbled onto your channel, and I guess the reason I found your channel is I was looking for the Book of Enoch, and because I had started researching the canon of the scriptures, trying to understand why they concluded on the canon, and then I came to realize that there's different canons out there, and basically just wanted to just hear what the Book of Enoch had to say. And I sat in on this class where this guy that was kind of so I live in Boise, Idaho, and there's a college over here called the Boise Bible College, and there's one of the professors came out to our church and he was speaking on the topic of the canon and extra biblical text and whatnot, and a lot of questions that people have and why they decided to leave certain books out. And he had this full presentation that he did, and basically came to the point at the end where he didn't even mention the Book of Enoch, and the Book of Enoch was already in my mind like there's something more to that than some of the other ones, and the Book of Jasher and Jubilees and Maccabees. Well, Maccabees is in the canon of the Catholic Bible. And I mean, there's a lot of stuff. Like, I never even read the Book of Judith. I've never read a bunch of the Apocrypha books, or just the extra biblical, whatever. I mean, there's a lot of different stuff. I mean, this is like one of the areas that I've seen that you focus on. And I don't know if there's anything that I haven't seen that is outside of that realm of thinking as far as extra biblical text, but
well, I think it's a wider phenomenon than just that. I mean, obviously there's what's in the standard corpus of the Apocrypha, and they vary all over the place. There's tons of books that depending on how you draw the lines, they're included in some Bibles and not others. And there are canon lists that go as high as 81 different books and whatnot. But even if you and like one of those is the Ethiopic canon, in which you find again the Book of Jubilees and also the Book of Enoch, of course. And this is why we still have it, by the way, is because it was kept in their canon, and so they kept it, for us, preserved for us.
Didn't they have the remnants and like the Dead Sea Scrolls, like little pieces of it?
Yes, there are some things that they had that don't appear in any other people's Apocrypha. I'm not sure how related they are to the Dead Sea Scrolls per se, but I know that there's something like 81 books in their canon, and I know you can look these things up, just as to which ones they are. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, by and large, seem to be something else entirely. But as far as like what these books are, there's a couple of ways of looking at it. The way that we've accepted canons, in the past, and you're talking about Catholic denominations, Protestant denominations, whatever kind of denominations you're talking about, they largely rest on either acceptance or their rejection by whatever authorities that they are, and they say they put these books into a box and they say, okay, these books are in and these books are out, and that's largely based on their authority and their judgments on these things, on these matters. They get together and they have these discussions, and then they basically vote on which ones are in and which ones are out. There was a lot of controversy surrounding the Book of Enoch because of all the angels coming down from heaven and mating with the daughters of men and creating giants and all that. So even though that's all in Genesis and kind of scattered little bits and pieces throughout the Old Testament, and to a larger extent in some of the apocryphal books, there's wide acceptance in Jewish tradition of these things, but in the canon, it's like it's kept to a minimum. It's as if the books that they chose selectively because they did talk about certain topics that were off limits and taboo. And if they included a lot of this stuff and were overt about it, you know what I'm saying, that they were kind of baby out with the bathwater, as far as that's concerned.
I use that terminology all the time, the baby out with the bathwater, from both sides of the spectrum, because people will accept something and reject everything outside of that realm of perspective. And then
the long and the short of it is that that what this is about is a restoration of scriptures and a dispensation. There were always meant to be three dispensations. If you and this is where, when you say, like, for example, what is, what was, and what will be, the dispensation that is would be like the Christian dispensation, the revelation of the Son, right? Yeah. The revelation, if you will, that was the Old Testament, and contained within this Old Testament, the Old Testament presages the fact that there will be three revelations, such as, like I've spoken of many times, in the Ark of the Covenant, for example, you have the three symbolic items, the tables of the law that are given to Moses, Aaron's rod that budded, and the golden jar of manna, right? Those three things in a box that is basically the box, if you will, or the Ark of Covenants, or see what I'm saying? And so, in other words, way back in the Old Testament times, there was this notion that there would be three dispensations. Even Jesus talks about, to him that overcometh, I will give to eat of the hidden manna. So again, what is, what it was, and what will be, the golden jar of manna, if you will be opened up, and we will be given to eat therefrom by overcoming this idea that there were just two revelations, that there's a third to come, and then by overcoming that illusion, if you will, then that permits us to eat of this third dispensation.
So real quick, I kind of want to address, for those of whoever are listening that might be having a knee-jerk thought on some of these biblical, or not, I'm not going to say biblical books, but the extra biblical like such as the Book of Thomas. I mean, I had kind of a knee-jerk reaction when before I ever started looking into this stuff, that like the Book of Thomas was considered like a Gnostic text, and obviously that had a negative connotation as well. And after kind of researching a little bit about what Gnostic actually means, it's actually gnosis, and they're in pursuit of knowledge. Now, I don't really know what your position is on that per se, but I just for the listeners, I just wanted to kind of clarify that, you know, we're investigating these things because we can extract, you know, what was intended, and it's not necessarily, you know, I mean, Gnostic doesn't necessarily it doesn't deter me at this point. I just want to take things for what they are, I guess. But go ahead. I don't want to deter too much.
Okay. Well, first of all, Gnostic is a term the way that it's ascribed, because it's so tainted, I think, with history and with people who were against them and defined them as a sect, and you know, I think that it's hard to come at it really using that term. Mm-hmm. You know, and again, I'm not somebody who likes to change terms or whatever, but I don't like the idea that Gnostic is what they say it is. In other words, they've defined it in my mind as something, for their own reasons, as something negative. And you know, whatever the case may be, what I'm teaching is not Gnosticism, not in the least, not in the way that they describe it. And I don't really like the association. When you read the actual text themselves, I mean, forget about who read them. Because if you think about it, how many different denominations claim the Bible, for example, the 66 books that we have or whatever? When you think about it, if you say group over here reads the Bible, but most other Christians consider them heretics. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, like a cult, you know, or something.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah. I don't want to name names, but that's me.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't want to let anybody off, but at the same time, you know, it's like, just because group X over here read these books, right? Are we going to say, well, because we don't like them, then the books that they read are also tainted? Maybe they're reading books that are right, but they're just reading them wrongly or differently. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And you have to understand, the trouble is when you try to lay out these scriptures, you have to kind of follow them closely, like literally what the words actually are saying, and follow them in that sense. When you read the book of Thomas, for example, the Gospel of Thomas, the first thing it says is that these are secret words which the living Jesus spoke, and Didymus Judas wrote them down. And he saith, whoever findeth the interpretation of these sayings shall not taste of death. So you have two pieces of, you have life contrasted with death. The living Jesus versus tasting death. In other words, if you understand the living Jesus, then you're no longer caught up in death. And so you have to understand the concept of living versus dead. The idea that what I'm saying, like I was saying about the Old Testament, or the New Testament too, for that matter, there are all of these off-ramps. If you want to go read this in this book. If you want to go read more about this, go read this in this book. There are all of these invitations for you to go read things. And then there's all these quotes and allusions to things that presumably are from other books, because they're not specifically spoken of before in the canonical stuff. They're referring to things that you should know, or information that you probably came from other books. And there's just the idea is that when you're living in this box and you're forcing yourself to believe what the top down is telling you, right? Mm-hmm. When Jesus says that, you know, that you have ignored the living one in front of you and spoken only of the dead, here you have living and dead contrasted again. But who did he speak of as the dead? The dead were the people who accepted the 24. It's like if I'm saying, if Jude is saying that Enoch is ancient and prophetic, and that here's a quote, you should go back and read it because it applies to these people, which is literally what he's saying. It doesn't take any faith to believe that. That's a simple literary datum. The literary data suggests that he identifies the book he calls it prophetic, he calls it ancient, and that he also cites it so that you can identify which, that you can verify that that is indeed that book.
So do you consider the Book of Enoch a pseudepigrapha, or is that just somebody's label that they're putting on it with the assumptions that they're making?
That's a thorny issue. The issue is that I don't think that you're supposed to be thinking of it in those terms. I'm thinking that you're supposed to be thinking of it as God breathed and Spirit breathed.
Yeah.
And that's hard to say because, like I was saying, if you look at the Bible as we have it, there are instances where people have said again that certain books were integrated. Again, you have like the Yahweh's text or the Elohim's text or whatever, and somebody has asserted that these things have been mixed together. You have the example where you have maybe, like we talked about with Daniel, having partly written in Hebrew, partly written in Aramaic, and we accept them. You know what I'm saying? You take the example of Matthew and Luke, for example, which presumably borrowed from Mark and maybe Q or some other sources that they talk about. You know what I'm saying? And Luke literally says, for as much as many take it in hand, to set forth the narrative, and they brought them to him and he took from these things and he, you know what I'm saying? And yet we still say that that's the gospel of Luke. You know what I'm saying? So we accept it as holy. So if a person, to me, I'm not saying I know or I don't know, because that's hard to say. What I'm saying is when I actually read the book, and that's the other thing too, we can get into that. How do you know from within? This is what I'm trying to tell you. It's sort of the within knowledge, the internal consistency, I guess, over against the scholarly knowledge or the secular knowledge or the knowledge of traditions or the acceptance of traditions or the acceptance of boundaries. Mm-hmm. The idea is that if we've placed a boundary around these books that we are locked into, then that kind of represents a spiritual death because
yes,
when you see an off-ramp,
I agree with you.
When you see an off-ramp, you know what I'm saying? When you see a link to something outside of that box, that's kind of a forbidden thing for you. That's kind of taboo.
Often people refer to what it says in Revelation. If anyone adds or take away from this book, that let them be accursed or whatever. And usually they are referencing that in terms of like the full canon, and oftentimes people don't realize that the canon is really just they sealed the canon by taking that specific statement in Revelation. When you had mentioned something about synchronicities, it just reminded me of if God's giving us little signs here and there, does that mean that you can't really say that God speaks to people outside of the canon? So I kind of take it like, does God move? Like, does His Spirit move in people now? I mean, I actually feel like, see, my beliefs are kind of transcending the concept of the canon, because I feel like God still moves in the people today. So I don't necessarily feel like, but go ahead. I want to hear your thoughts on that. Okay.
So first of all, going back to do not add and do not, take away or whatever. I was saying before, a lot of times you really have to go down into the specifics and really just follow it for what it says. It literally says, "For I testify unto you that every man who heareth the words of the prophecy of this book, if any man shall add unto these things, God shall add unto him the plagues that are written in this book. And if any man shall take away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God shall take away his part out of the book of life and out of the holy city and from the things which are written in this book." Now, getting really, really specific and minute. Now, this is a general blanket statement about Scripture, maybe, but it is definitely a very limited scope, because he talks about the plagues that are written in this book. Okay, so when he says the plagues that are written in this book, is he referring to the plagues in the book of Revelation, or is he talking about the plagues that are in Deuteronomy, you know what I'm saying? Or, you know what I'm saying? Is he talking about, Exodus or whatever? I mean, just like the idea is that, what is that with reference to, I guess is what I'm saying. So first of all, again, and I'm not saying this, as a defense of adding or taking away books, but just looking at what it actually says. He says that if anyone shall take away from the words of this prophecy, God will take away his part out of the book of life, out of the holy city, and the things that are written in this book. And what is written in this book of Revelation about the holy city, the book of life is written about in the book of Revelation. So it's self-reflective, first of all.
Yeah.
The idea is that, can you take and generalize? I think in a way you can. I think it really just depends on how you look at it. First of all, if you say, okay, when he says that he heareth the words of this prophecy, okay, every man that heareth the words of this prophecy, if any man shall add unto these things, again, hearing the word of this prophecy. In other words, they know what this prophecy means. In other words, if this prophecy has been revealed to you and you hear it spiritually, in other words, you understand the higher level meaning, right?
Yeah.
It means that you are in a position of knowing what this book says. Okay, so go back and read it with that knowledge. For I testify that every man who heareth the words of this prophecy of this book, in other words, understands spiritually what I'm saying to you, right? Hear it.
Yeah.
All right? If any man shall add unto these things, right, having heard this message, having understood this message, knowing what this message means, then they're perverting it by adding to it. See what I'm saying? Because that God shall add unto him the plagues that are written in this book, because they understand what those plagues are. And in my Revelation series that I did, we broke down what all of this stuff basically was, and it's kind of a lot to talk about here. But the idea is, like, when you read the book of Enoch, are you adding to the words of the book of Enoch as you're reading it? Are you taking
interpretation will factor into however you decide to take the words. I mean, context determines meaning, and culture determines meaning as well. I mean, you're going to insert your own bias on it. So, I think that those things need to be accounted for when they're reading a text.
If you hear spiritually what's being said, in other words, you understand the words of prophecy. If you hear the prophecy, right? Why would you add to it, or why would you take away from it? Because the same would be distortion. In other words, if you distort what's being said, right? Or if people have this literal ideas that you're adding books is adding to the words of this prophecy. And that's not, I don't think, what's being said, because we're not altering anything that's written in this book. And I'm not literally adding, and Robert says this, that, and the other. You know what I'm saying? In addition to what Jesus is saying here, or in addition to what the angel is saying here, or in addition to what John is saying here. I'm not throwing my own words in and among the book there. You know what I'm saying? I'm not altering it in such a way that I'm adding to it, nor am I taking things away from it. Like, for example, take away, like, for example, the book of Jude, like what I was just saying before.
Yeah.
If I say that, okay, Jude says that Enoch is a prophet, Jude says that he's ancient, right? Now, I say he's not a prophet, then I'm taking away from what's being said. And if I say that he's not ancient, then I'm taking away from what he said. And so if you understand it from that point of view, that's what the scholars are doing. They're saying, hey, listen, even though Jude seems to think this is ancient, we affirm that this was 2 centuries BC, 3-4 centuries, whatever they say, we're contradicting Jude. So in other words, they're taking away from what Jude is saying. And so the consequence of that is that you don't go read the book of Enoch. The book of Enoch gets basically destroyed and thrown away, and ignored, and that's taken away. And that's, that's taking away scriptures, and that's taking away the meaning of the scripture. You know what I'm saying? And so I think people will distort. But I think that this really strictly applies to people who hear the words of this book, or hear the words of prophecy. Because again, the idea is that there was a way of understanding by means of keys and by means of insights. Like what I was talking about earlier. The idea is that there were three symbolic items in the Ark of the Covenant, this giant box of symbolic items. Tables of the law, the Aaron's rod which budded, and then of course the manna.
Yeah.
right? And again, breaking it down, the idea was that the tables of the law were given to Moses. That was the first dispensation of three.
Mm-hmm.
And that when Aaron's rod was, when his priesthood, and again, the book of Hebrews goes on about this, that the true high priest, Jesus, is at the right hand of the Father, right? But Aaron is a symbolic. He's a shadow, right? That whole high priesthood is a shadow of things to come and not the thing itself. That Aaron wasn't standing himself at the right hand. He was an image of that. So the idea,
that gets into one of the topics I want to address about the temple and or New Jerusalem, because obviously there's type and shadows. That you say that there's a shadow of what is to come, and there's a lot of foresight just based in a lot of these traditions, or just all. I mean, there's it's like interlaced throughout the scriptures of things to come, and I love that you're pointing that out. But go ahead.
well, again, it follows the what is, what was, and what is to come, right? What is at the time was the Christian age, right? And that dispensation. So that represents sort of the second revelation, the revelation of the Son and his high priesthood. The fact that his rod, which again, the word canon and the word cane, like we use the word cane in English, it derives from the same word. It's a measuring stick, like a yardstick or something like that. I mean, in terms of its effect. And to say that Aaron represents that second revelation because he's a stand-in, if you will, symbolic, if you will, for the true high priest, the shadow, if you will, of the heavenly thing, right?
Yeah.
That he symbolizes this. And so when his authority is challenged, what does the thing do? It actually buds and bears fruit. So it undergoes, like you said, a transformation. So the second canon, the second cane, in other words, the rod, if you will, brings forth fruit. So the canon, if you will, also brings forth spiritual fruit, something you can eat, spiritual food, right? And it shows that that the New Testament, if you will, is going to bear fruit and is going to bud, if you will, and that canon is going to there's a transformation, if you will, of that canon into something greater than itself and something that shows that it's different from the others. All right, so there's a transformation of that second item that's in the Ark of the Covenant, right?
Yeah.
And so, in other words, that's sort of the twofold aspect of this of the scriptures. In other words, the way that Christianity's been taught, that is to say, constrained within the boundaries of a canon. There's the Old Testament and there's the New Testament. That's like saying in our covenant with God, there is the Old Testament and there is the New Testament. But it also sort of belies the fact that there's a third symbolic item. And what is that item? In the book of Revelation, where it talks about, let's see if I can pull that up, where it talks about, to him that overcomes, I will give to you of the hidden manna, right? So in other words, to overcome the idea that the canon as it's been given to us, right, is limited and constrained to just those two dispensations, is a limiting thought. And it keeps us from going on to the third dispensation, which is to say the hidden manna, the manna which is hidden inside of this golden jar, in other words, right? So in other words, that's...
So I got to ask a question about mana, because that's kind of always, like, I played video games and stuff when I was younger, and we had mana for, like, doing, like, power potions and stuff like that. And it made me think of, like, what if mana is just the symbolic type of food that is, just pointing out that it's just a symbol, in other words, that that represents the Spirit of God, right? And God actually ordaining something. So that's what manna is to me. I mean, it's a type and shadow, so to speak.
Well, I mean, I would say that because it's a covenant, because it has to do with covenants, it's within the Ark of the Covenant. that there are these three, again, symbolic items. So it's symbolic in the sense that it represents something. It's symbolic in the sense, but I mean, first of all, it's hidden. The word apocrypha, for example, means taken away, apo, and krypha, which means to hide, right? So it's taken away and hidden, just like the keys. You know, the lawyers, as it speaks of in Luke, or the scribes and the Pharisees, as it speaks of in Thomas, have taken the keys and hidden them, right? They did not go in, nor did they allow you to enter into it. So the idea is that the keys are this internal knowledge, this internal understanding. So if you follow the internal logic, like what I was saying, of there being three symbolic items, it means that there's three dispensations. The Bible's basically supposed to be a trilogy and not a duology. It's supposed to be that, in other words, the Old Testament sort of fathers, if you will, by means of prophecy. It sort of fathers or engenders, if you will, the second revelation. It paves the way, if you will. It presents in types and shadows that there will be a Messiah, and that the Messiah will suffer, and that he will have a testament of his own. He will come and he will speak words of his own, right? Whoever will not hear that prophet shall die, in other words. In other words, the idea is that it engenders, and in that way it is a father, and in that way the scripture in itself, in a sense, bears a son, if you will, because it is engendered from the Father. In that, so you have the testament of the Father, which is essentially the first revelation, and latent within that Father, there is the testament of the Son, and then there's a third testament, which is of the Holy Spirit, the Comforter. The Comforter will come, right? Elijah will come. I will give you to eat of the hidden manna, right? He will lead you into all truth.
So Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are the three revelations of God, right? Is that so? Like God the Father,
because we've had the Comforter, again, is the one who will come and lead us into the truth, to teach us all things, reveal things to us.
And that's the third dispensation. Is that what you're saying?
That, yes, the Holy Spirit to come down upon us and cleanse us. That brings the kingdom, if you will, the New Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that is above, down.
Are these dispensations overlapping, or are they just completely separate?
Well, you got to think about it, I think, like this. Like, I keep going back to certain archetypal things, like, you know, the Ark of the Covenant. You could look at it other ways too. Like, for example, what are some other triads that presage this? Like, for example, there's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for example.
Yeah.
Now, Abraham was the one who received the covenant and the promises. He was told he would be a father of many nations, right? So you have the idea of fatherhood again, because, again, he's a shadow, he's a symbol, right? And then late in his life, in other words, sort of at the end of the Jewish age, if you will, you know, he brings forth a son, and his name is Isaac. And the son is, you know, in typology, even in standard Christian typology, Isaac is always seen as, you know, Jesus. I mean, you know, you can look that up anywhere. You know, the idea is that it's the same typology. He represents kind of the sacrifice. He is the son, and he's placed on the altar in the same way that Jesus is going to be, in a sense, offered up, you know, before the Father. For our sins and for our transgressions. And then there's, you know, and then of course he's spared, and then, you know, then comes Jacob, right? Which, again, he's the one who transforms into Israel, right? So in other words, there's that third component of the triad of those three, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So you have, like, the Old Testament symbolized, you have the New Testament symbolized, or Christianity symbolized, or Jesus symbolized, or however you choose to look at it. Yeah. And then you have Jacob turning into Israel. Right? The idea is that that's when you become a different person. You actually become, if you will, God's people at that point.
Yeah.
So that's like the third dispensation, or the third revelation. So again, it all goes back to what was, what is, what was, and what is to come. And he uses the same patterns too, with time, times, and half a time. A time is 2,000 years. And then times is what was. So time corresponds to what is. What is now is the 2,000 years. And then times is what was. That is 2,000 years, right? And then half a time is the same as 1,000 years, and that's the millennium. And that's why there's silence in heaven for the space of half an hour, because the idea is that it's
is that half a time?
Yeah, half a time.
Okay, gotcha.
So in other words,
there's a lot of symbology in the scriptures that's why a lot of churches don't even talk about like the book of Revelation, because I don't think they understand the symbology, and they're just afraid to overburden people with information that doesn't make sense to them, I guess.
Well, I mean, it's full of whores and fornication and dragons, and it's kind of full of. I mean, it's pretty graphic in a lot of ways. It's probably it's a little stark for some people, and like you say, it's confusing. And the thing is, everybody has an opinion about the book of Revelation. I mean, that's a really tough nut to crack, to try to make any sense out of that, because I mean, there's every theory in the world about it. But the idea is that none of what I'm saying is really imposed on the book of Revelation. If you want to talk about that particular book, the idea is that it all comes from the understanding that there are supposed to be, again, 3 revelations. This is why Enoch is not for his time, but for a future time, right? Mm-hmm. And then he talks about in chapters 104 and 105, he talks also about, I know this mystery, that to the wise will be given the scriptures, and they will know them, and they will understand them, and they'll be able to interpret them, and they'll be able to reveal them to the people. Those are the elect who are to come. Mm-hmm. Right, and the mystery again in the beginning of Enoch is like, this is this not for his time, but for a time to come, for the elect, and took up his parable concerning them. Right, so it's all about those people who are going to be here at the end of time. So in other words, right here, the transition between Jacob and Israel, after the time of the church of Laodicea or whatever, when they finally get spit out of his mouth, you know what I'm saying, because they don't care about the truth, or they don't care to learn about it or whatever. Or even oppose it when it does come out, which probably will happen. But at the same time, it's like you come out on the other side, and you're in the kingdom, and you reign with him, and you sit with him, because that's his will, to reign through us, and to live through us, and for us to exist, if you will, within him, and so that his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The idea of the manna, if you read it, was that it was gathered every day early in the morning, and then it would fade away. It would be like as if to say, perhaps, that there are times when these scriptures manifest themselves and then they go away, and they manifest themselves and then they go away, because from time to time throughout history, these things have come about. Like Enoch resurfaces about the time of Jesus, because the book is obviously being read by Jude and his congregation, for example, obviously influences what he's saying, but is obviously also not among the 24 that spoke in Israel according to the authorities. You know what I'm saying? So because they're limiting it to those 24, let's say, they are the dead according to Thomas, because they're ignoring the living. The living is the idea is that you break free of that paradigm, that duality, that is just the Old and the New Testaments. For example, you can break free from that and eat, if you will, of the hidden manna. I will give you to eat of the hidden manna. Like that. And the idea is that the manna was gathered on the 6th day, or in the 6,000th year, in other words, the 6th millennium, to be consumed on the 7th day, which is a lot like saying, look, these scriptures were gathered. You can find corpuses of the Old Testament Apocrypha, the New Testament Apocrypha, the Nag Hammadi codices and stuff. I think the biggest problem that people are going to be faced with is this not opening up a huge can of worms? Because even if you could somehow pin it down to, well, okay, maybe we'll have a look at Enoch or something like that, because there's some basis for it. Perhaps it should be, we could look at that and maybe entertain the idea of, whatever. It's not limited to just that. The idea is that you're opening up the floodgates, that there's going to be all these books, there's going to be all of this stuff. So you can't contain it, you can't limit it. It's not really limited in scope. It's like this big, wide open thing. And how do you control it? Becomes
so convoluted at that point, it seems.
The way that you do is that that's where keys come in. and that's where the idea of the idea is that if you recognize it, I guess, in these writings, and you recognize it from internal evidence, like in other words, you know how to read it. Like reading the language of parables is like reading any language, like reading English or something like that. In that you should be able to tell from the parables that are being told based on your ability to interpret parables. You could take a book and say, I can make sense of this, and it conforms to the idea of the threefold revelation. Therefore, it's consistent, and therefore it's authoritative on its own merits rather than some pedigree that some scholar or some religious figure gives it.
By the way, I didn't plan on getting on too much metaphysical type stuff, but I did notice patterns in like dreams and near-death experiences having little patterns of these mythical or parabolic type meanings behind a lot of the things, like you were mentioning, and that's interesting to me that there's messages that are coming back that are similar to that kind of parabolic meaning. And I don't know, I just wanted to mention that for the listeners that know that I'm way into near-death experiences. But
I mean, that that's the thing, though. I mean, different things like that are going to be his, I guess, relationship with each person individually. He'll speak to certain people through visions or through dreams or through, something like that. I've had experiences, like I said, with coincidences and synchronicities and things like that I can speak to, that I know affected me.
Okay, so we're back.
You were talking about how, you had dreams and stuff. I'm not sure what the content was of these dreams and stuff. I was just saying that, straight up.
Now, specifically, I didn't necessarily have the dreams, but there's a lot of people that say that there's certain figurative meaning to a lot of the, like Carl Jung kind of identified to a lot of these type of symbologies within me, like dreams and like parabolic meaning within Carl Jung didn't get into near-death experiences, but you see a lot of that in near-death experience as well, as these deep, complex meanings, I guess. But go ahead. I don't know if you have any thought on that, but.
Well, I mean, I haven't had a near-death experience. It's hard for me to speak to that, but there are a lot of people who I guess have had near-death experiences, and that's fairly well researched. I mean, I was actually watching something a few weeks back about, people who studied that and made that like their life decision to study that, and I think one of their fellow colleagues was dying or something, and right as they were about to die, they were like, yeah, this is how it really is or something, or tell them how this is how it, like those are your last words or something, but at least it's some kind of confirmation that these things are real, or there's some evidentiary, statement to that effect. I mean, you're dying, right? I mean,
Yeah, when I finish my documentary, I'll send it to you so that you can see what I'm talking about. I'm about halfway done with it. It's very intense, but I don't know if you're into that kind of stuff. But
the thing about it is like I have a very limited scope. I mean that isn't to say that I don't have wide-ranging interests, which I do. I have probably way too many interests because I spend a lot of time pursuing things besides just this. You know what I'm saying? But at the same time, whenever I'm talking about these kinds of things, pretty much the thrust is getting at what mysteries there are, getting at what these patterns are. I'm really trying to flesh out something here that I think is real. Like, I don't know how familiar you are with my later work, but like right now I'm still working on what's called the Agrapha. The idea is that these are all of these sayings that are supposedly attributed to Jesus. And there's tons of them. I mean, there could be as few as 15 or 16 of them, depending on how strict you get, or it could be pretty open-ended. There could be hundreds and thousands of it, depending on how many, different sources that you bring, and offer as his sayings or whatever. But looking at the ones that were gathered into volumes, like around the turn of the last century, let's say, the ones that, just kind of arbitrarily say, these are the ones that I'm drawing from just because they were brought forth by other people 100 years ago, and this is what, they thought, was legit or whatever. That the idea that even piecing those things together, arranging them just thematically, right, and arranging them according to the way in which the words themselves want to go, it's like that is where you really come to get a sense of how alive the word actually is, like as if it's a living word, not as if you're playing around with them. Because I try to take serious measures about putting things just arbitrarily or trying to make things say what I want them to say. Like literally the arrangement was based on an arrangement that one of them already did, which I thought was really impressive, because I felt like, even though it was coming from this source and that source and this and this and this and this other, when you put them together, it was as if it was a very straightforward, linear teaching. You know what I'm saying? That to me is one of those intangible kind of things. The idea, it looks a lot like the Gospel of Thomas, I guess, for one thing. The way the Gospel of Thomas is a saying, on down the line. And Thomas is a little bit jumbled too. I mean, not to say that it doesn't belong in the order that it's in, but a lot of times it'll say something over here, and then 20 verses down the line, it's kind of like you get the continuation of the one that was 20 verses prior to it. So there are ways in which you can take things and move them, in which you can get a question and you can get an answer like that based on what's there, but it's a little bit pliable, it's a little bit movable.
Yeah, I've kind of looked at the scriptures like it's not exactly like 2D. There's like kind of like a 3D or 4D perspective. And are you familiar with Chuck Missler?
Only in passing. I haven't really followed any of his stuff.
Okay, so I wanted to point out one thing that I think it was Chuck Missler that identified to this. And then I think also Rob Skiba kind of pointed this out. But basically... there, the patriarchs, Adam, Seth, Enos, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. I pointed this out on another podcast, but I wanted to actually ask you and see what you thought of it. Have you ever heard all the meanings of their names in sequence?
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah, where... Yeah, I couldn't rattle it off to you, but
I actually have it right here, and I wanted to read it real quick. Okay. So Adam means man, Seth means appointed. Well, it just kind of reads like this: man appointed mortal sorrow, the blessed God shall come down preaching that his death shall bring the despairing rest. That's all their names in sequence as far as the meanings. I thought that was interesting.
Well, and what does it mean? Because again, let's say that what we're talking about, the idea is that this is a prophecy about the Son. This is obviously a prophecy about Jesus and him bringing us rest. Obviously that means something, because you don't just have that kind of coincidence. I mean, you can't just take names and throw them together, Bob, Dick, and Harry, whatever, and then, expect them to make any sense. This is actually very deliberate, obviously. And so that's a prophecy of the coming of Jesus, of course. It's just one of many. But that was like the idea. What we're talking about is something that Christians already accept. They already accept that there's the idea that interwoven into the Old Testament, there is the teaching of the coming of the Messiah. When they're on the road to Emmaus, Jesus is saying, he starts explaining all the things that were written about him in the Psalms and the prophets and everything. So all of the prophecies that had to do with the coming of the Son and all of that were obviously fulfilled in him, and their hearts were burning within him, of course, because they recognized it, and then, of course, he disappeared from their sight or whatever. Mm-hmm. The idea was that, there were prophecies about him. And like I'm saying, there are also prophecies, I think, about the Third Testament, the third revelation. And that, again, is encapsulated in these triads. You see this also in the New Testament, where you have at the Transfiguration, for example, you have Peter, James, and John are asked to follow him up to the mountain, and appearing with him in their exalted state is Moses and Elijah. And they're actually having a discussion And in Luke it is, I think, we actually discussed that it's about what was going to happen to him in Jerusalem. And so the idea is, this is really strange, because it doesn't really tell you where they're coming from, but the idea is that Moses and Elijah in their exalted state have appeared across time, if you will, to be with him in his time. Like, he even speaks about this as far as Abraham. He said, Abraham saw my day and, was overjoyed. The idea is that these people either interdimensional, I don't know how interdimensionality works, but either interdimensionality appeared across time to him, in which case we're talking about a certain timelessness that they have in their exalted nature, or they literally went from their time to Jesus's time, either in some kind of transport, some kind of spirit, some kind of interdimensional something or other.
Man, you're starting to touch on some of the stuff I talk about all the time.
But in any sense, however you choose to see that. I mean, even Paul, when he talked about his transport into heaven, he couldn't really pin it down. He didn't know whether it was in body or out of body. I mean, it's got to be a really far out experience and whatever. I mean, and indescribable.
Sounds like a near-death experience as far as I'm concerned.
But the idea is that they're there at that time in front of Peter, James, and John, and they're in their exalted state. And what they're discussing, of course, is his death on the cross, what was going to happen to him, his passion. And so if this is Moses traveling into the future and Elijah traveling into the future, let's say, in the same way that Abraham saw his day, for example, by way of analogy, then they would go back to their time with a full knowledge of who he was, what he was doing, and what their mission was, in a sense, in terms of their prophesying about him, or their emulation of him, or whatever, however it is to them, whatever their part is that they play in the drama. They have advanced knowledge of him, and they see his day, if you will. They see his time coming, or whatever. But in any case, the idea is that you have Abraham, Isaac, and Jesus, Moses, and Elijah.
Yeah.
Okay. Up at the top of the mountain in exalted state, and they're talking. And then you have down below, you have James, Peter, and John.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that there's sort of a mystery here to work out. When Jesus is with his disciples and they're traveling through Caesarea Philippi, of course, and the question is asked, well, who do men say that I am? And they say, well, some say you're Jeremiah, or one of the prophets come back to life, or whatever. Then he specifically asked them, and in one case, Peter, straight up, he says, but who do you say that I am? And then Peter answers him, well, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed this to you, but my Father which is in heaven. Right? Mm-hmm. And he said that I say to you that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. So the idea is that in this particular image, Jesus is based on Peter's ability to receive from the heavenly level and not the flesh and blood level. Because again, flesh hasn't revealed this to you, but my Father which is in heaven. The idea is that Christ is associated with that heavenly meaning. The mind of Christ is to be in that heavenly level, to have that revealed to him by the Father. In other words, as opposed to flesh and blood, which is the lower level understanding. Because again, that he was one of the prophets come back to life or something, that presumably was wrong, and it presumably is sort of the lower level understanding that he's just another prophet, or that he's just a human, or that he's just, what I'm saying, along those lines. So that's flesh and blood thinking. That's lower level thinking. That's not really what the Father reveals. The living Father, if you will, the Father shows that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And the idea of the living God, again, living has to do with transcendence of these artificial barriers, not just of canon, everything that's based on that canon. The idea is that it's an enclosed system that just goes around on itself, and that's it, right? So you just go around in circles. You're just, like a millstone or something. You just go around and around and around it, because the logic goes around on itself. If you hit upon something like, for example, Jude or whatever, where you take it and you go to Enoch and you start reading that book and you start going out of that, then you start understanding where they fit into the equation. That is to say that they're outside of this box, and it helps you to transcend, I guess, that limited understanding. And so it's a method getting you out. So in other words, but if you associate with Peter with Jesus, getting back to the image though, the idea is that if Peter represents the church, because that basic title is basically given to him. If you take that as a given, which again, if you work from that, you have Peter representing the church and Jesus representing, of course, the second revelation, really himself. But I mean, you have the association with those. And the idea is that you see it all the time too. Peter, do you not love me more than these? Right? The idea is that he's supposed to be the one who loves Jesus more than everybody else, at least in his mind, at least in Peter's mind. And it's interesting where this idea comes up because at the very end of John, you have this sort of weird sort of rivalry thing between John and Peter, where he says, he explains to Peter about the death that he has to undergo, and then Peter immediately turns around and sees the disciple whom Jesus loved coming behind him, right? And he basically indicates him. He says, "What about him?" And Jesus says, "Well, if it should be my will that he should remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." So again, you have the idea of to come, associated with John. So again, just like you have scriptures that are to be given, I will give you to eat of the hidden manna. Elijah will come. Right, which brings me to my next point. So the idea is that John represents the elect in the sense that the elect follows the Christian age. The elect come after the Christian age. That they're there during the age of transition, and then during the millennium, that they are the body, if you will, of all three. They have the Old Testament, the New Testament, and they have an understanding, if you will, of the rejected scriptures, the hidden manna, that they're able to expound and to speak of, like it speaks of in Enoch 104 and 103 or 105, and they have that knowledge that they're able to reveal it to the world, right? In other words, they're able to exposit this stuff in such a way that it allows them to accept these books. And so, in other words, that's their function, and that's why that book exists for them in that time.
So now, when you say it comes in threes, or like the symbology of the three, so when you say Old Testament, New Testament, would the third be kind of like the Rhema word or the Holy Spirit speaking to his people kind of thing, or is that different?
Well, in terms of spirit, then yeah, because again, he talks about, look, don't even think about what you're going to say in that day, because I will give you a mouth and a wisdom that no one will be able to gainsay, right? The idea is that at the time in which you are supposed to know, the knowledge will be given, that you will be given a mouth, and that you'll be given so in other words, it's all waiting to be revealed in time. Mm-hmm. And so the spirit, obviously, when it's the right time, it's going to seek out people in order to reveal it to the world. Again, like at the end of Enoch 104, 105, it talks about reveal it to them with your wisdom, right? For you are a gift or a reward upon the world, right? So the idea is that they're bringing the good news, if you will, of further revelation. And they're receiving it because it's the time. It's not because they're special, because everybody's already rejected the invitation. These are the people that are at the ends of the roads, the ends of the street, the people who weren't really invited, so to speak. In some ways, it could be seen almost as an act of spite if you look at it like that, because the idea is that, look, the Christians were invited, the Jews were invited. You talk about something like the Book of Enoch when it was found. For example, 1773, I think F.F. Bruce or whatever goes down into Ethiopia, and he finds this book, brings it back to, I guess it was England or wherever he's from, and he writes this stuff, he writes it out, translates it into English or whatever, publishes it, and then basically the clock's ticking. We have this book, right? Yeah. And what do we do with it? Well, it's academic. It remains purely academic. Maybe if I'm in academic circles and my forte is studying Ethiopic or something, or ancient Jewish studies or this, that, or the other, I might use this book as a reference. I might use it to make arguments about, the age or the provenance of it or something. I might study it in those aspects, right? Yeah. It exists purely in the academic realm. Okay, so since 1773 or sometime shortly thereafter, the book exists in English. The book exists and is translated into other languages, of course, and all this is going on. And the religious authorities or whatever aren't preaching it in the church. None of this ever comes about. So, in other words, there's all of this time. And then other books start showing up, and they start getting put into their own little volumes, Old Testament Apocrypha, New Testament Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, whatever. And they put them into separate volumes and keep them all academic. You know, maybe they do a decent job of translating. Maybe they do a decent job of putting them together, gathering them, you know, whatever. But they're not preaching them to the people, so it's not effective. It doesn't have its, you know, all of this time. So it's as if it doesn't exist. It's kind of like manna that's gathered off of the ground, if you will, and kept in a jar. You know what I'm saying? And sealed.
Yeah, that's interesting.
You know what I'm saying? And so it's just sort of sitting there, not fulfilling its, you know what I'm saying? But his word doesn't return to him void. So the idea is that the people who were invited formally, the church, the Jews, the religious establishment, that as long as they're not willing to even so much as address these things or to even, you know, have a discussion about it, it's just they're caught in their paradigm. And the idea is that they have to be taken out of that paradigm. And again, I'm not saying I'm not trying to put a lot of negativity into it. I mean, you could, but the idea is I don't want to be judgmental, and I don't want to point the finger and say, oh, you should have done this and blah, blah, blah. And you're not like, you know what, it isn't quite that. You're there to be a reward to the world. You're there to provide the knowledge to the world and to be, you know, to give them the, if you will, the good news of it. You know what I'm saying? This is why he says, well, just getting back to the analogy, looking at, okay, he says, well, what about him? Speaking of John, what about him? What are you going to do with him? And Jesus says, well, if it should be my will that he should remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. The idea is that he's still putting the onus on the church because it's really up to them to do it, right?
Yeah.
But that he is Simon Bar-Jonah, that is to say, the son of John, means that John is in a sense going to have to engender that in him. You know, that in other words, at the time of his coming, and he corresponds again, because if he's going to remain until the time of his coming, that puts him basically at the end of time. So John represents, symbolically, Peter represents the church, John represents the elect. And then, of course, Elijah is to come, right, and to set all things straight. The idea is that Elijah also is a future tense, is to come. That John is to remain until I come, right? So the idea is that those are the two future ones. They correspond with that third dispensation. They correspond with that third revelation, the spirit and power of Elijah. See, he even talks about this. Elijah has already come, right? In the sense that there was a spirit and power of Elijah in John that prophesied of the coming of the Son, and so he perform that same function. He says, you know, one's coming after me whose sandals I'm not worthy to tie, or whatever. He talks about the coming of him. So he's speaking prophetically in that spirit and in that power. And then he speaks of Elijah as to come. So he speaks of it figuratively as in the future as well. So in other words, there's going to be another voice, if you will, crying out in the wilderness, you know, teaching us to make the way straight. And the idea is that, what does it mean to make the way straight? The idea is, like, again, when you come across something like Jude, for example, I keep using this example, but it works. The idea is that it says what it says. You know, he cites the name of the source. He says that he's the seventh from Adam. He gives you that datum. He says that he prophesied. That's another datum. And then he gives you the quote, which is another datum for you to match up with that book, so you know exactly which book he's talking about. So he's crossed all his T's and dotted all his I's. He's done everything. He's basically flat out told you that this book is ancient, it's prophetic, and you should read it. And that it pertains to these people. He's saying it pertains to these people. It was prophetic in the sense that it spoke of people who were going to come in and subvert the mysteries. You know, in other words, that's where he's coming from. And so if these people who come into the church unawares, if you will, the people he's talking about, he keeps using these apocryphal books against them. He's saying, the faith that was once for all delivered unto the saints, you should fight for this, right? Mm-hmm. Well, again, if he says in connection with the faith that was once for all given to the saints, and he keeps quoting Jude, or he keeps quoting Enoch, or he quotes the Assumption of Moses, right? The idea is that this is the faith that we're supposed to be fighting for. He's literally saying to go and fight for this faith. And what's interesting about Jude is that it's backed up by Peter. Peter actually takes the book of Jude and he writes essentially around it. He sort of expands upon it, if you will, because almost all of the book of Jude is contained within the second book of Peter. Because this is like, I'm trying to keep my eye on the ball here. I think that there's like a literal third testament that we are literally fighting for, that we are trying to bring into existence, and everything else, whether it's true or not, I'll put it this way: you have to have something you can prove. You have to have something that you can bring before the world. And what I'm saying is that the Bible itself is a legal document, essentially, that's written up between God and man, his covenant. And he's basically saying that he's going to give us further revelation. And there are very specific ways to go about doing this. There are definite rules to it. But that, again, it's not going to be something that anybody knows when it's not time to know. But when it is time to know, then it's going to be revealed to the whole world. I mean, we're living in a day and age where you can sit in your living room, your bedroom, or whatever, and talk to potentially anyone in the whole world.
I really wanted to touch on that for a second, because I do feel like in some ways there is a great revealing now. And you could say that there's a separation of the sheep from the goats. I feel like these statements that Jesus made, I don't know exactly how physical it is, but I do feel like there's a spiritual side to that as well. And I'm starting to see that more and more now. And I don't know what your take is on the eschatology of Jesus coming back, and our Armageddon, or I don't know what your perspective is on that necessarily, or even how the apocryphal or the extra biblical text tie into that.
Okay. Well, here's the thing. Wow, that's a lot to take on. The idea of, okay, so when you read in Revelation about the city of Jerusalem coming down out of heaven and onto earth. Yes. That's, in some ways, that's analogous to saying Jesus is coming back or anything else. The idea is that it's going to be returning. The question is it really going to have, are you literally going to be able to look at it, take pictures of it, videos of it, or something? Is it coming back as a giant thing coming down? You know what I'm saying? Or when Jesus says that he cometh in the clouds. Well, but again, I think there's a symbolic aspect to it.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets tough, because you could spirit things away entirely, such that you could say, oh, it's all spiritual, none of it's physical or whatever. I don't really take that extreme stance. I think that the physical exists as a conveyance, if you will, of the spiritual. So like when it says that Jesus walked on water or something, I don't have a problem thinking that Jesus physically existed and physically walked on water. I don't have a problem when people say he physically healed the sick, or gave sight to the blind, or that he raised the dead. The fact that as an individual he walked the earth and healed somebody physically who was physically sick, I don't question that at all. I don't see that that's an issue. But what I'm saying is it was done, if you will, as a conveyance of something beyond itself, or as a thing kind of beyond itself, to show something in a sense greater. Because if, for example, and one of the kind of secrets to understanding scriptural meaning is to sort of parenthetically place the word scriptural in front of everything, or spiritual in front of everything. So that, like, for example, if Jesus heals somebody's physical eyes, that basically stands for his spiritual eyes or his spiritual seeing as well. Or if he, heals someone's spiritual hand, so to speak. Again, a physical hand. It means that he's healing their spiritual hand too, such that he allows them, in other words, to do works. You know what I'm saying? In other words, in a spiritual sense, if we're having a spiritual awakening, then we're rising, in a sense, from spiritual death, like a man who was brought back from physical death. You know, or that even the death of Jesus himself as a man and the resurrection of Jesus himself as a man on the third physical day is an image of the Logos being railroaded, if you will, by the powers that be, the religious authorities, based on their own jealousy or whatever, their own desire to have the power and the kingdom themselves, rather than give it over to Jesus. The idea is that they wanted to take the Logos, if you will, and put the Logos to an open shame, in the same way that they took man and put the man. And so, in other words, if Jesus is a living parable, if you will, of the Logos, in other words, the higher level meaning, the understanding of the word, then everything that happened, that he was placed under the earth. Why do they use the term under the earth? Because the idea is that the heavenly meaning is couched in earthly terms. So he's subjected to earthly thinking. The Logos is, in other words, hidden away under earthly teaching, under, if you will, placed in a kind of a spiritual tomb, so to speak.
Yeah, and I've been trying to address the symbology of hell and Sheol, or the grave. Like, I was thinking about this a lot lately, because a lot of people, there's kind of a huge divide in the church. Well, more so now, because I'm starting to realize that people are starting to not believe in hell as much as before, but I'm still trying to work it out as far as like the understanding. Like, Sheol is the grave, and then like Gehenna and Hades are a description of hell in the New Testament. And I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on that, 'cause if that even ties into what you're saying at all, as far as Jesus going into the grave, or if that's any relation. But
well, okay, so yeah, that okay. Here's the thing. There's actually a lot of tradition about that, and in First Peter talks about he went and he spoke to the spirits which were in prison. And if you read the Gospel of Nicodemus, there's a section in it called the Descensus. He goes down into the underworld, and Adam is there, and he sets free Adam and Eve and all the prophets and all the children and whatever of mankind. And even in the book of Matthew, there's like one verse where it talks about that the dead actually came out of their graves and walked around in the city of Jerusalem and spoke with many people, which is one of those weird sort of things that, like, man, I really want to hear more about that. And it just sort of comes and goes, and then that's it. But I think that there's an affirmation that this was a literal thing that literally took place. Mm-hmm. Like I said, I don't have a problem when they say that Jesus literally died on the cross and literally came back to life in the flesh. Like, that doesn't affect what I believe it at all. What I'm saying, it's just a further wrinkle on it. That the idea is that what is done in the flesh is done as it's more efficient than that. It carries with it further meaning than just that.
An underlining symbol.
It's more complex than just that. So, that there's a literal hell. I don't know that it's like a subterranean place, literally under the earth, like you could dig a hole to it kind of place. I don't know that I believe that, or I can even imagine that in a literal sense. A lot of this I don't take literally. I think hell is like metaphysical space, like where the dead go. Yeah. Is it under the earth literally? Mm-hmm. I don't know. I can't answer that kind of question because I don't have that kind of equipment. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I put it that way. I mean, there's not going to be that kind of information, and if there is, I don't know where to find it. I mean, as far as that's concerned, I think there is a place where the souls go and where they spend some amount of time understanding what they did. When you talk about the rich man in Sheol, he was in torments there. He's really just waiting. That's basically
in Abraham's bosom.
Place.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and the idea is that everybody's in some kind of waiting place. Where that is, I don't know. I couldn't tell you.
Yeah.
It's probably some other kind of space, but
these are the kind of questions that I ask on my channel and podcast, just trying to understand the complexities of whatever transcends this reality, I guess, because I do like to touch on those things, and honestly, I don't know. I mean, I can only take what other people are relaying through.
I'm sorry, not to interrupt, but here's kind of the way I look at it. There are places where the Bible specifically says, and he spoke a parable, or had a vision, and the vision meant this, or they had a dream, and the dream meant that, right? Yeah. So if you have a vision and it means something, or you have a dream and it means something, or you have a parable and it means something, or you go look at the book of Revelation, and is he talking about literal whores and literal dragons and literal people with the sun under their feet, whatever? I mean, is he literally seeing? Maybe he's literally seeing it, but he's talking about some kind of spiritual space, and not like literal dragons with literal, whores dressed up in scarlet on the back. You know what I'm saying? It's not literally that. And something that you almost have to wrap your head around is that I think everything is in a sense parabolic. Everything is. Like, that isn't to say it's not real, but it has that meaning attached to it anyway. So in other words, if Jesus literally, like I said before, if he literally raised the physical dead, but it was as the reason for that would have been that he is someday going to raise the spiritually dead, and by means of the logos, if you will, by means of the word, right? So what he does in the flesh as a man is an image. It's sort of like this divine ambiguity. If you look at it in terms of he is a man and he physically raised people up, and that's all you see. In other words, that's literally the whole. It begins and ends right there. It's a glorious thing. And so it's kind of hard to see past that, because in our everyday lives, I'm not stopping on the street and raising people from the dead or healing the blind or something myself. I've never seen anybody literally do that. I've never heard of any, proven accounts of people actually doing that. And so the fleshly part of me says, well, that's a little tough.
It's just a symbol of what happens to someone's spirit when they have a come to Jesus moment or whatever.
But I don't think it's just that. I think that it's just that I think that there is power over the physicality of things, but there's also God's will. There's a time for these things. I think time was given and space was given for the apostles to do things. Like, even it said that, signs accompanied them, right? The idea is that they went out into the world and Jesus gave them signs. I mean, there are some things that the physical mind would just say, this is nuts. Okay? Like when Philip just sort of disappears and transports and appears somewhere else in the book of Acts. And you're like, wow, that's a little bit out of the blue. Or when Stephen is standing in front of Paul or Saul and all of the other Sanhedrin or whatever, and he literally has the face of an angel. And he literally looks up into heaven. I mean,
I can see into heaven, yeah.
They saw him in his angelic state. Like you talk about Elijah and Moses being at the Mount of Transfiguration, and Jesus and Moses and Elijah were all in their angelic state. If you ever saw somebody in an actual angelic state where they had a heavenly appearance, like the shining, glowing, whatever, how do you put that person to death? And Saul did it. And the Sanhedrin did it. This is kicking against the pricks. This is saying, I can do despite to what I see, right? I can condemn a man even though I know he's on the verge of becoming an angel. You know what I'm saying? I have this in me. You know what I'm saying? People are capable of distortion to such an extent, you know what I'm saying, that even a truth such as that, such that it was self-evident to them at the time. Because again, he was looking into heaven. He literally saw the Father at the right hand. He was conveying this to them. That he was literally transcending this realm, and he was seeing what was behind the veil, if you will. He was seeing into the heavens, and they knew it because they saw him with the face of an angel.
Yeah.
The idea is that these things can happen, but they're in limited doses, and I think the reason for that is because if Paul was able to do despite what he saw, he was able to breathe out threatenings against Christians after he saw one turning into an angel in front of him, right? The idea is that people can be like that. The idea is that if we were out there performing miracles and doing wondrous things all of this time, apart from the obvious problem that there wouldn't be any reason to believe because you'd see it, but I think that people would bring a lot of condemnation on themselves because they're all going to do despite to what they see. In other words, they're all going to act in the face of their knowledge, and that's going to compound their guilt. So in a sense, to free us from that guilt, we have to live with a very limited ability to believe in these kinds of things. And so these things don't happen commonly. I imagine to whatever extent that they happen in other ways, like in the form of synchronicities or in the form of premonitions or in the form of things like that, where people will know in themselves that there is a God. And people will know in themselves that there is a plan in their life. But it's hard to manifest physically because other people are guilty or are accountable for what they know.
Yeah. I want to touch on one thought before we start wrapping up. But basically, so we had kind of briefly touched on the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven. Now I'm starting to see that there's some sort of metaphor in a lot of things. I mean, there's so many things to really consider. And I had done a study when it was talking about the description of the New Jerusalem descending from heaven, and then it was actually talking about like the New Jerusalem like having streets of gold, and then I started like thinking of my, like, I remember when I was growing up, like they were talking about streets of gold being in heaven. And then I was like, wait, if the New Jerusalem's coming to earth, does that mean heaven's going to be on earth? And I started considering all these metaphors or these symbols as being really just kind of like a form of mythology, so to speak. But it's really touching on things that are legitimate, like real physical things, but they're being embellished, so to speak. And what I'm saying?
I would say that one of the issues that we have a tendency to do what's called reification. That is to say, we take things that are metaphysical or metaphoric even, and we solidify them in our thoughts, and we can't get out of this I guess way of thinking. The way I look at it is, you look at the heavens and the earth as being essentially that which is heavenly or upper level or the ultimate meaning behind the words or behind the sayings, and then you have the surface level, the earthly level. That the idea is that when you take things literally at and only at face value, then that blinds you to the higher level meaning or the heavenly meaning. So if it's coming down from heaven to the earth, think about what I was saying before about the ideas that the heavenly has couched itself in earthly. The heavenly terms have couched themselves in earthly terms. When in the Gospel of Thomas it says, when you make eyes in place of an eye, and a foot in place of a foot, and an ear in place of an ear, and all. What he's saying is, look, you're taking a physical eye and you're replacing it with a spiritual eye, which is possible to do because you see it on a spiritual level. And so when you've done that, you've gone from the dead to the living, so to speak, because you're not constrained by the illusion that there's just these two things and it's just what your denomination says, and you don't just go around in circles and make no progress. You're able to back out of that illusion and see it on a higher level, and you become living, because now all of a sudden you can take that old meaning or whatever and that where everything is reified and codified and cut and dried and whatever, and just sort of set it aside and see in terms of the spirit. The Jerusalem, in a sense, is us, and the Jerusalem is God. We are his temple. When he says that, okay, the entrances are the patriarchs. Well, again, that's one of those trifold things too, because the patriarchs were first in terms of the scriptures, okay? You know, so we enter in through them. So that's like the Old Testament. And then the foundations are the apostles, right? And so the idea is that that's the second, if you will, aspect of it. And they're sort of co-equal. You know, the length and the width of it are the two, the foundation. And that we are the pillars, or that we are the walls, and we are that vertical aspect of it. And to him that overcomes, I will make a pillar in the temple of my God. So the idea is that we become a co-equal part. It's just as wide as it is high, as it is deep. You know, the idea is that we are that third dimension, that vertical dimension, that third aspect of it.
Yeah, so that's kind of the thing I was trying to point out in one of the videos I made, is that you know, Jesus says that I will give you a white stone in reference to the New Jerusalem, and I believe that his people, or the saints, and he's described as the cornerstone, and so we are actually being added into, you know, each of the bricks kind of builds up to the top of this, or becomes this building, right? And it's a figurative building, but it's spiritual.
They use the same metaphor in the Shepherd of Hermas.
Yeah.
About the building being the church.
Yeah. So yeah, we're the church, and you know, people can wrap their heads around the church body being a church, but oftentimes they'll think of the building. Now, the spiritual building is really what it is. It's the shadow that you were talking about earlier, when you know, it's kind of the, you know, the prediction aspect of you know,
well,
what.
Let's look at that in context, though, because I agree with what you're saying. The new name that is written, again, which no one knoweth, saving he that receiveth it. So the idea is that, first of all, you have to receive it. So you have to ask yourself what is given. What I'm saying is that what we are given is a revelation. That's the third thing. That if you receive this third revelation, because I mean, maybe not from the top, but look, it says, let's see, he's talking to the church in Pergamos here. He says, and to the church in Pergamos, right, these things saith he, which had the sharp sword with two edges. So first of all, what's the sword? The sword is the word of God. And why does it have two edges? Because it prophesies in prospect. That's like the angel going over the Ark of the Covenant this way. And then it reveals things. It offers revelation in retrospect. Just like, you know, at the on the walk to Emmaus, for example, with regard to the Second Testament, the Testament of Jesus. The idea is that he said that all of these things that were written about me were fulfilled in me. And then they understood that in retrospect. They were like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And then their hearts witnessed within them that was true. That all of these things that he said about himself had come to pass, and they had seen it. It was still fresh on their mind. They were still feeling it. You know what I'm saying? And then he was there, and he blew their minds, and he disappeared, whatever. And so, but the idea is that his sword, where does his sword come from? He's got a
comes
sword
from his mouth.
out of his mouth.
Yeah.
Right? At the time of judgment. And what is the sword? The sword is the word of God. So in other words, the idea is that it cuts both ways, that it cuts forward and it cuts backwards, if you will. That is to say that it makes its way, if you will, to the end of time in order to go back and, in a sense, undermine everything that they've done and cut it off, in a sense, replace it with his word. He says, and I know that works, where there dwellest, even where Satan's seat is. So they'll hold fast my name and have not denied my name, even in the days where Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was slain among you, where Satan dwelleth. So there's a couple of things that Satan is doing. He's entrenched himself. So he's become entrenched in their community. And he says, thou holdest fast my name and has not denied my faith. So the idea is that the most likely explanation here is that Satan is teaching them not to hold fast his name or to deny his name and to deny his faith. Yeah. So in other words, what is his faith? What is the faith that we must fight for? Like even in Jude, the idea is that there is teaching, that there is revelation that is being denied, and that there were people who didn't deny it, even in a place where Satan had become entrenched. And it says that I have a few things against thee, because thou hast there them they that hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block to the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed unto idols, and to commit fornication, and now also them that hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which I hate. So what's all that about? Well, again, he comes back to the two-edged sword thing. He says, repent, or else I will come with thee quickly and fight against them with the sword of my mouth. Yep. The idea is that whatever they're teaching, and I don't know how much I can get into it particularly here, but whatever it is they're teaching, it is defeated by his own word, the sword. In other words, a teaching that comes out of his mouth, his word that comes out of his mouth. So his word alone is that. The word is there to combat the deeds of the Nicolaitans, the deeds of the doctrine of Balaam and Satan, and how he's trying to get people to deny the faith and his name. But it's interesting what the payoff is, because maybe the payoff has something to do with the issue at hand. It says, to him that hath an ear, that is, in other words, a spiritual ear. If you're able to hear this spiritually, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him that overcometh, I will give to eat of the hidden manna. Mm-hmm. So, in other words, to overcome something, to eat of the hidden manna, means that not overcoming it means that you don't get to eat of the hidden manna. And this is a little bit subtle, but if you stop and think about it a minute, what's the point that's being made? If you overcome, you get to eat of the hidden manna. Well, in other words, the manna is being hidden. So this has to do with that testament.
That kind of reminds me of where it talks about that you could be blotted out of the book of life. It doesn't necessarily. You know what I'm talking about, or is that in a different context?
Well, again, it's if you add or you take away from his words that are written in this prophecy, you know what I'm saying, then the promises will be taken away and your place will be taken out of the book of life. The idea is that it has to do with those who hear and those who have knowledge, because you're acting on this knowledge. Remember, how Paul, despite the fact that he saw Stephen turning into an angel before him, still took the side of the religious institution or whatever, still held on to his Judaism or whatever in the face of all that. So he was really at that particular time, he was being shown to be a rather despicable character, despite whatever he became later. And he knows this because he owes this kind of debt. He talks about how he's the chiefest of sinners, and you can imagine, because how many people have you put to death that you saw proclaim the truth to you in such a way that you knew it, and also you had the proof of their transformation in front of you. You're able to lie to that sort of extent. The people that hear the words of that prophecy spiritually, they were also capable of lying against it. They were also capable, to deny people the revelation. In other words, their hearing, the way that these leaders had the hearing, would be to take away from them, and it would be to take away from the word. Right? Mm-hmm. So the idea is that there were despicable characters in the early church, some of whom were redeemed. They owed a tremendous debt. They paid it, like Paul. You know what I'm saying? I mean, to the extent that, that was the reasonable expectation, to turn around and to face it like everybody else did. You know what I'm saying? And to be in with them. But he says, okay, so to him that overcometh, I will give to eat of the hidden manna. So not eating of this hidden manna somehow relates to the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, so to speak, somehow relates to eating things sacrificed to idols. What are we eating, first of all? What is our spiritual food? It's the scriptures. But if the scriptures are sacrificed unto idols, like let's say a canon, a contrivance, right?
Oh yeah, interesting.
If you then commit spiritual fornication, because again, throw the word spiritual in front of it. Fornication, spiritual fornication. Eating things, eating spiritual things, right? That kind of thing. Idols, spiritual idols. Again, these must have been the kinds of things that were the doctrines of the Nicolaitans. They had a false concept of some sort. They had an idol of some sort. And the idol had to do with what they ate. So put two and two together. What are you eating spiritually? The scriptures. What is the idol? Well, that which keeps you from the hidden manna, whatever that is. So that's at least something to work with. The idea is that what they're teaching you teaches you against that which they've gone and hidden. See what I'm saying? And so if you then get to eat of it, then it says, well, I will give him a white stone. It doesn't necessarily say he will make him a white stone, but there's a new name written, which no man knoweth saving he that receiveth it. So in other words, if the hidden manna is the hidden scriptures, you have to receive the hidden scriptures. That new name, I believe, is that the elect. And that stone is to say a New Testament, like the third revelation.
You know, I got to point out that identity. So, like, I've done a lot of thought on, like, you know, if you have an identity in Christ, then your identity is kind of like your name, right? So if you're given a new name, you're given a new identity. That's kind of how I looked at it.
Well, it is. Okay, like, for example, if you go back again to the Ark of the Covenant, just go back. If you say you have three symbolic items in there, and one of them is about the Son, and one of them is about the elect who are to come, it means that the Son has been named, and it means that the elect have been named. In other words, he's calling it from the beginning. It's going to be parsed out in three different dispensations. One having to do with the Jews and the Abraham and all the early people, and then one having to do with the Christians, and they're named, you know, because the Son is named. He's named in all of this symbolism. He's named, if you will, by being symbolized by Isaac. He's named, if you will, by being symbolized as Aaron. He's named, if you will, by being what you said earlier about, you know, he shall come and bless it and he will give them rest, thing like that. He's named. So he's calling them from the beginning. See, if you find the beginning, that's where the end is, right? Like it says in Thomas, right? And you will know the end and will not taste of death. That is to say, with this knowledge, it's impossible to trap you in that box. And you won't be considered dead. You won't be considered, you know, unworthy, if you will, or, you know, a mixture of the two, you know, the worthy and the unworthy. You know, so I mean, the idea is that the white stone, and also with in the Gospel of Thomas, there's another place where it talks about stones. Let me see if I can find that real quick.
Yeah, I was kind of, as you're looking that up, I'll just tell you that for the listening audience, I want to make sure that we're not going to touch on everything, of course, because this is just such a vast approach to, you know, this trying to understand the scriptures and how transcendent it actually is. And honestly, I was trying to think of a segue of how we could actually transition into the closing of the podcast. And to be honest with you, it's just so vast. I don't even, I want to just keep going for like the next 10 hours. But in reality, we have to you know, live our lives a bit.
You can. You go, because the thing about it is, it's like, you know how like they say like out of every little strand of DNA that you have in your body, you could form theoretically a clone of you because it has all of that information in it. You know what I'm saying? If there's a common thread throughout the scriptures about breaking this paradigm and breaking this spell, it exists sort of ubiquitously throughout the scriptures. And you talk about how big this is. It exists sort of throughout the canonicals and throughout the apocryphal as well. it's all got the same kind of DNA to it. And so it really, because if it's true, it's true, it's true, it's true, and it just keeps on being true. And if it was the plan, it always was the plan, and it always will be the plan. It was hidden in prospect to be revealed and understood in retrospect. That's where you come to rest. That is to say, you know the beginning, and from the beginning, you will understand the end. From the beginning, there were always meant to be 3 revelations. And then so you come to the time of the end, and the timing is right. It's the 7th day, right? The idea is that you have this answer in retrospect, right? So you have the revelation, right? You have the very specifics. You have everything that they prepared for you to eat on the 6th day, here for you to eat on the 7th day, spiritually, the food, the hidden manna, in other words. What you have to do is you have to overcome the canon, the rod. You have to overcome the idea that it's the measuring stick that everybody else gives you, and look to the one that your high priest gave you, which is to say that with fruitage, that with foliage, that with growth. In other words, you've taken what you've had and you've transformed it into something that is now something you could eat spiritually. It's now something that you can, that has transformed. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that that you can be transformed. And what I was saying with Thomas, okay, it says that Jesus came and took him and told him 3 things, and then Thomas came back to his disciples, and they asked him to his friends, and they asked him what it was that Jesus told him. And he said, if I told you one of the things that he said to me, you would take up stones and cast them at me, right? And then fire would come out of these stones and consume you, right? Yeah. But why is it one of these things, right? Because there were 2 things that were basically already accepted, the Old and the New Testament, right? But there's a third thing. And if he were to go to the other disciples, let me see. Okay, so the way it literally reads is it says to his disciples, compare me to someone and tell me whom I'm like. And Simon Peter, which is like the church, says to him, you are like a righteous angel. Because again, he's seeing him in terms of him being glorious. Matthew, who I believe in this particular instance represents the Jews, he was a tax collector. His gospel is the most Hebrew of them. He says, well, you are like a wise philosopher. And you think about how the Jews always called him rabbi and teacher. And they referred to him in that sense. And then Thomas said to him, Master, my mouth is wholly incapable of saying whom you are like. And Jesus said, I am not your master, because you have drunk, you have become intoxicated with the bubbling spring, which I have measured out. Spring being water, measured out. He's measured out his word, in other words. And he took him and withdrew and told him 3 things. When Thomas returned to his companions, they asked him, what did Jesus say to you? Thomas said to them, if I tell you one of the things which he told me, you will pick up stones and throw them at me. A fire will come out of the stones and burn you up. The idea is that if he's coming back to what symbolically represents the Christians and the Jews, and they each have a stone, right? There is, in a sense, one stone.
Or they are the stone.
Old Testament. Well, that's true, too, because they are living epistles, the Bible speaks. I mean, a lot of this stuff rolls around on itself. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? You could pick up one end of it, but it relates to other things. And then pick up stones and throw them at me. The idea is that they're going to try to attack him with their scriptures. Mm-hmm. And it says that fire will come out of the stones and burn you up. In other words, you're not going to be able to hurt me. You know what I'm saying? I will tell you this one thing, but you're going to oppose me. You're going to try to use your dispensation against me, right? Mm-hmm. And when you do that, right, a judgment, if you will, the fire, if you will, of the Spirit of God will come out of their testaments. In other words, the revelations that were given to them, in a sense, burn them up. In other words, consume them. Which is to say that there's, again, he talks about, I will give you a mouth and a wisdom that no one will be able to deny or to gainsay. The idea is that whenever they come up against it, whatever it is, they won't be able to do it. Saying, in other words, so they'll kind of, in a sense, self-destruct. They'll bring that judgment on themselves. Yeah. Saying, but the idea, I think, is that the stone, even though it represents the people of the elect, I think in particular it refers to that third stone, of which Jesus is the cornerstone. because he comes in the middle and unites those who are to come with those who came before. And so in a sense, he becomes the head of the corner because he is the Jewish Messiah and also the one who engenders us, the elect, who calls us into existence and gives us a name, which is...
Yeah. Well, gosh, Robert, I wish I could keep talking to you, but I've reached the threshold of my time as far as my ability. So, I feel like we've addressed some pretty deep issues, and for anybody who hasn't heard of Robert, check out his channel, Apocraphile 1970. I imagine you're still going to be active on there here and there, Robert, but if you're not like currently like passionately pursuing that, I encourage you to keep the ball rolling as much as you can, because you definitely influenced me a lot, and I appreciate everything you do up to this point. So but as far as how you could be reached, or even just the content you're trying to put out there, like a new social media sites or whatever. I mean, is there anything that you want to share before we end?
There's really just my BitChute channel. It's just the same. It's Apocraphile 1970 on BitChute. I'm going to be putting stuff up there, at least at first, largely that I can't have up on YouTube for one reason or other. So it'll be different stuff. So, it's not like it's just another channel with all the same stuff on it or whatever it is. So if you're looking for different kind of stuff, you probably want to look over there. And also the main website, which is run by YouTube user Jesus Love 723.
Okay.
He runs that entirely on his own dime, so you can help him out. But it's scriptural-truth.com.
Okay.
So you got to put the dash in there. It's kind of a popular website. Like, even if you don't put the dash in there, sometimes it comes up in the searches or whatever, but it's scriptural-truth.com. And when you go there, you're going to see all kinds of apocryphal writings. You're going to see a lot of video links to what's on my YouTube channel. You're also going to see just a lot of stuff. There's a ton of content on there, the things that you can download. The Super Gospel, which, again, we didn't talk about, but it's like a book that I compiled that's basically a gospel harmony, but instead of it just being Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's also Thomas, it's also the infancy gospels, it's also the Descensus, it's also just all kinds of gospel material that existed in the early Christian age, all made into a linear gospel. Something you could understand from beginning to end. All together, it's like about 16 hours. And I put it all up in audio form so you can listen to it. On my BitChute channel, I put a read-along version of it in different sections, the infancy sections, the ministry sections, and sections, and all that. So I encourage people to read that if they want to kind of have an overarching sense of what all of this material, gospel material that exists, says. It's by no means complete. It's something almost by definition could never really be complete, but it's pretty extensive. It could be updated, to add more to it. But largely, it's a demonstration of the way in which the word is consistent from beginning to end, and how it tells one big story from beginning to end. A lot of it is like one source brings something up, another one continues the thought, another one builds further on it, another one may conclude it. It's showing something like a power of the Logos itself by its own existence. The words want to go wherever they want to go. So that's something I encourage people to read. Awesome.
Well, that's very powerful stuff, and I appreciate your time. And man, I hope that we could talk again down the road. There's some awesome deep issues to get into, and I'm trying to ramp this thing up so that I can get a broader reach as well. So I'm hoping that we'll have an opportunity to talk about some more deep issues down the road. But again, I guess at this point we'll just call it a day, and we'll keep in touch here down the road. Okay.
All right. Well, thanks for having me.
All right, Robert. You have an amazing rest of your Sunday, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you, too.
All right. Bye.